I'd like to introduce my friend, Katerina Whitley. We were just chatting about how long we've known each other. Katerina was a colleague back in my days as an Episcopal communicator. I was working in the Diocese of Milwaukee in the bishop's office, and Katerina and I met at a conference. The best professional conference of all time is the Episcopal Communicators Group, a really wonderful group of people. And we met when I dragged my little baby 6-week-old son along to a communicators conference in San Francisco, and that's when we met.
And I thought you were very courageous to do that.
Oh, well, I wasn't going to miss this great group of people, so the baby got dragged along. That's what happens with PKs, you know, they just get dragged along. And then over the years, you are, as I mentioned to you, at the very top of my bag of tricks. Everywhere I go, I'd like to have you come. I've had you speak to groups in the Diocese of Milwaukee. You came to Lexington, Kentucky, the week of 9/11.
Yes.
And you were with us then, and you were with us in Marble Falls, Texas,
Yes.
just before, like days before we moved to Lexington, to Williamsburg.
Yes. Right.
And then you've reminded me that you have been to St. Martin's. Shirley Smith Grant had you. So maybe you can remember that and then tell us a little more about yourself by way of introduction, and then I have some questions for you.
Yes, St. Martin's visit was an extremely tragic day when those babies were massacred in Newtown, and I arrived at the airport. A friend picked me up and she told me what had happened, and I was so devastated. I did not know what to do that night, and I asked your then congregation if they wanted to go ahead, and they said yes. And I tried to choose a monologue that spoke to that kind of suffering, because there's so many stories of extreme human suffering in scriptures. And that's how we find our connections and realize that they were human beings like ourselves, and try to discover where they found their strength and were able to continue going, as we have to do today.
Yeah. So that is really one of the things that you're shaped as a storyteller. Your biography on your website says that you grew up in the Greek tradition of storytelling, and so that's been really what you've done for your whole life, is to tell stories.
Yes. And I have a chapter in my memoir, and it concludes, "Story saved my life." And it's very important to have that resource. I remember sitting in the balcony as a little child, with a little child's chair, and reading book after book after book. And that's where I was really formed by reading these stories and the deep, unforgettable impression some of them made upon me, that eventually had a huge influence on my thinking and my faith formation.
Mm-hmm. Well, so one of the presenting opportunities in this conversation is that you have a memoir coming out. And so I love that you're using a Greek word, a word that we use in church, anamnesis, to title your book. So I wonder if you could maybe talk a little bit. You know, I sent a recording that you sent us, reading that chapter about church, remembering church. Maybe you could sort of go in and out of the memoir, and we've been talking about memory, and maybe you could just talk a little bit about your childhood and about what you're remembering in your memoir.
Well, you call it anamnesis, and the English language, the transliteration of Greek words into English, always change the accent.
Right.
So we say anamnesis, and we say ecclesia, and we say kenosis, so the accent is different, but it's the same word. Well, if my students were here, they would start laughing because I spent so much time in my teaching giving them etymology, which was something totally new for them. The Greek words that have entered the English language are almost all of them compound words with a prefix, and then the root word that can be applied to so many others. So in Greek, ana means again. That's a prefix. And mnesis comes from memory. And one word that the audience would recognize immediately is if we say mnemonics. So that is the root of memory, comes from that Greek root. And anamnesis or anamnesis is to remember. Of course, within it, this has the again, but just for emphasis, one more time. And in my tradition, which originally was truly evangelical in the good meaning of the word, based on biblical studies, my church called Holy Communion anamnesis every Sunday. That was the word that we use, and they still use, remembrance. So it's a very important word for me. And when I was thinking about a title at the very end, I thought I would try it. We'll see if my editor thinks that Americans would object to that, but I like it.
Well, as long as you can live with us mispronouncing it.
That's all right about that.
People read the book, they can mispronounce it. Tell us about the process of remembering and putting together the memories. And did memories come? And tell us about you have a really unique life, having lived as a child in occupied Greece.
Yes.
So maybe talk about that and about the process of remembering and writing.
Yeah. Memory is a mystery to all of us. And there are a lot of books written about it. I don't think anybody understands exactly why we remember what we remember. And I acknowledged at the very beginning that it is a personal thing. I cannot say that this is exactly what happened, but I can say that this is what I remember. And those very, very early memories where I have this strip of film in my head, and it seems as if I've always had it and it has never left me. Now, why I would remember one day in a whole year or 10 minutes out of a day must have to do with how dramatic or how important or how seminal that memory was. So one of the first memories I begin with is I'm 3.5 years old. And I lean out of the window and I see this stream of gray-green people and motorcycles with sidecars driving through the street. And in my mind, the barbarians have arrived. So it was the day in April of 1941 that the Nazis entered the city on their way to Athens. That's one very vivid memory.
Tell us what city you grew up in.
Thessaloniki, which is the second city. And this is the city that St. Paul visited very, very early in his arrival in Europe, right after Philippi, and established the church there. Unfortunately, the British translators called it Thessalonians, so they missed the whole syllable. It should have been Thessalonikians, but that's the city, and that's who I am. I'm a Thessalonikian, and I remain that. A very important connection that I felt all my life to that reality of the early church.
So we sent out your chapter from your book about the importance, the centrality of the church in your family life.
Yes.
Is there anything else that you'd like to say about about the importance of that. I loved your description of the bow wouldn't stay on your head. I mean, a lot of children have these painful memories about how they couldn't cooperate with what they
the
wanted.
taffetas that my mother put on us. There were 3 girls and 1 boy in the family. The church, the ecclesia, was truly as much a part of my life as my home was. We were there almost every night, except 2 nights of the week. We were there most of the day on Sunday. It was the only kind of fellowship, education, and entertainment we had. The ancient Greeks used to have the amphitheater where the plays were performed, and there was education, and that was theater for catharsis, and that was entertainment. For us, it was our little congregation. We were very close. We children were very creative because we had no literature of our own, no hymns of our own, no poetry of our own. So we kids, and this is the 3rd generation Protestants in my family, we created our literature. So it was a very creative time, and that made it fun.
Were you in the minority, not being Greek Orthodox?
Extreme minority. I mean, negligible, so that most of the time the Greek government didn't acknowledge us at all. They do now because so many new religions have entered because of immigration and tourism. But for a long time, the relationship was very fraught, and for a while it was dangerous in the early part of the 20th century. It's a little bit more amicable now, but it's still quite separate from the Greek Orthodox. And the reason we were ignored is that Greece has a state church, and that makes everyone else feel like an outsider, because to be Greek, you're automatically, by virtue of your birth, a Greek Orthodox, and when you're not, you're suspect. It took me some time to understand that, and I sympathize with how they feel. It made us a little stronger, I think, to be different, to be a minority, and to more interdependent.
I want to come back to that and how you ended up in the States in college, and because that was also a religious connection to college. But before we leave your hometown, I'd like to know if you could describe it for us. I remember one time you describing the view outside your window, which struck me as being something completely wonderful. And also, do you have what memories do you have of the Nazis? What was that like as a little girl to be occupied?
Oh, I have many chapters describing, there was a kind of a grayness to it. I remember it as gray. I remember it as a gloomy time, kind of a very sad time. Most of the people of Greece suffered terribly from famine, the first year of the occupation, a scandalous kind of famine that was so serious and so bad that finally the International Red Cross intervened. Otherwise, the Greeks would have become extinct. It was that bad. In Thessaloniki, because we are in the northern part of, and it's Macedonia, the northern province of Greece, we were surrounded, except for the sea, we were surrounded by villages that had gardens that produced a lot of the food that we ate. And they were able to bring some of it in the black market so that people would survive. Because one thing that the Nazis did immediately was to strip the land bare. They took everything, absolutely everything, and sent it back to Germany. without any regard of how the people would survive.
Mhm.
There was a great tragedy and a great shame, really. So the city itself is very beautiful. It's built like an amphitheater, and it has this beautiful deep bay, and then it rises up to the hills and a mountain behind, the Mount Hotiatis. So the views are always stunning, but the description that you remember, I think, is my high school was outside the city on a hill, and I could sit in my classroom, look out the window, and see across the bay and see the mountains, see Mount Olympus with the snow always. And that's an unforgettable picture and memory. So we were very connected to not just to the history of St. Paul being there, but also to the mythology of the country. It's very much, yes. Yeah. I
mean,
understand.
Mount Olympus.
Yes.
That's pretty much ground zero for Greek mythology, you know?
It is that. It is that. Yes. Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. 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 And it's the names that we use. For instance, my mother's family must have been very poor. I never got to know them. The western part of Greece, a mountainous, a gorgeous part of it, very isolated. And all the children in that family, all 7 of them, had ancient Greek names. And one wonders that probably my maternal grandfather had not been able to go to school. Where did those names come from? Mm-hmm. It's kind of magical how the race has this memory that is never extinguished.
What was your mother's name?
Persephone, which you call Persephone. But she had that, it is a very famous name of the goddess of spring and the underworld. So, a very tragic name. And what I didn't tell you in the memoir, a lot of it deals with my mother's illness and death. She died when she was only 36. So that happened simultaneously with the decade of wars.
Persephone. Blank has asked about your siblings and where are you in the birth order, and did they experience, did they have the same memories that you do? Are they still living, and where are they?
I have lost my 2 older siblings, my sister, who was 4 years older, and my brother, who was 2 years older. And we remain, I and my younger sister, Nikki, are the only 2 remaining of the 4, but everyone lived into their 80s. So that's something to be thankful for. Mm-hmm. I had many first cousins also, and I remained close to many of them. So it was a very close community, and we all had the same last name because my grandfather had sons. The only daughter he had died when she was only 12. So all of us had the same last name, and there were quite a few of us, so we were known in the city quite a bit. Mm-hmm. Yes.
So your evangelical religious setting, how did you decide at 16 to come to the States for college, and why college? Why not finding a high school? Were you ready for college? And someone else has asked, Richard has asked, did someone sponsor you as you immigrated? How did that work?
This has a lot to do with my high school. And I have, I think maybe the most interesting chapters maybe about this wonderful school I went to called Anatolia College, which started as a missionary school in the eastern part of Turkey back in the 19th century by American missionaries. And when the massacres of the Greeks and Armenians started happening, they moved the school from Mersipan, Turkey, to Thessaloniki,
Wow.
And so the school had Protestant missionary roots to begin with. Of course, because they had to adhere to the school educational system of Greece, they were not open about religion instruction at all. It was treated the way the other high schools treated it. But right after the war, we had American young people, idealistic, to come and teach us. And one of them was my music teacher. And he got me a scholarship to Mars Hill College without my asking for it. Announced it, and that's how I came after a lot of arguments. But he was my sponsor, but Mars Hill gave me the scholarship for 2 years. But because the Greek high schools was so difficult and had so many courses, I had enough course credits to enter college.
And then you were at Mars Hill for 2 years?
2 years, because at that time it was a junior college. And then another very nice school gave me another very nice scholarship, Furman University in Greenville, South Carolina.
Sure.
So I was really very fortunate, very blessed to receive so much generosity. And those people in those two small schools at the time were people of integrity and faith, and they left a marvelous imprint of their personalities and their rectitude within me. And I always wanted to teach after that because of who they were.
So then, after you left college, did you do 4 years of American college?
I did the 4 years, and then I went to seminary, and then I went to do some graduate courses, and then I went to language school, 2 language schools in California, and I became kind of a sampler of various educational branches. But the one that I fell in love with was theology. And I spent a lot of time in biblical studies and theology because for me, it became the most important subject that one can possibly study. And it remains so.
So during your time in the South, then, as you just got here, some friends from Atlanta want to know how did you feel like, were you accepted in the American South? You were a stranger.
I had no problem, or if there were any problems, I was not aware of them because I was so self-confident, and I knew English because of the wonderful training that I had had in my high school. I understood and I could speak. Naturally, I was not familiar with the idioms and the expression of the language, but by my sophomore year, when I started studying English poets, I fell in love with the language. Mm-hmm. And it became very important to me. And eventually, of course, a wonderful tool of self-expression. I have these diaries that I kept in college, and I see when I switch from Greek into English. Yes.
Yeah. So all those courses of study, going from school to school to school, how did the transition happen that you gave your full attention to being a storyteller? And how did you find your way into the Episcopal Church, the Anglican tradition? I imagine those things happened simultaneously.
Well, they happened gradually, and I'm dealing the first part of the memoir, which is finishes with my first night at Mars Hill College. And the second volume, which I'm writing, deals with this spiritual awakening, never abandoning the faith, but growing in very different directions because of biblical interpretation and scholarship, and because of the influence of social justice in the teaching that I received. So I went to Baptist schools, Southern Baptist schools, and they were wonderful. And the people who taught me were some of the best and most open minds. I owe them a tremendous debt of gratitude. The husband I married, the young man I fell in love with, and he was also in the same tradition. He had gone to Baptist schools, and we visited Baptist churches, but eventually the time came, and this was during the 60s, during the terrible time of the civil rights struggles and then the beginning of the Vietnam War. We started looking for a church that spoke, as my husband used to say, spoke to our condition. And we started visiting an Episcopal church. And we were so taken, I remember both of us weeping by the literature.
Where was this? Where was this?
In Williamston, North Carolina, a very small town, Church of the Advent, a very dear place. So this was in the mid-70s. And it was our home. We knew that this is where we belonged. And after we were confirmed, within 5 years, the new bishop of the diocese came and lived in our town, and so I became involved with editing the diocesan paper. And that led me to the national involvement, which was the bigger church, which gave us all great joy and a kind of a connection that was not just parish related or even diocesan, but international. The Anglican communion is a family, very important, and you have experienced that, so you know what I'm talking about.
You joined the presiding bishop's staff when the presiding bishop with the old presiding bishop's fund for world relief. Many of our folks will remember what we now call Episcopal Relief and Development.
Yes.
So when did you join? With Ed Browning? When did you join the presiding bishop?
It was with Ed Browning, and my first work, actually the first time I created something for the PR work of the fund was the terrible Hurricane Hugo, which was in 88, near Christmas, December, I think. And I started thinking of, we knew so much at the National Center, Church Center, because we received all the information. And I wondered how the people in the churches would learn about these disasters. And people from the office had gone to Nicaragua at that time because it has suffered terribly from the hurricane. And so I created this tabloid newspaper called Lifeline of the Presiding Bishop's Fund. And it became a vehicle for communicating with the people in the parishes the stories of the people I met in foreign lands or in various dioceses, people who were affected by the gifts of Episcopalians, but who did the work themselves for rehabilitation and development. It was a very exciting time to meet these Christians from around the world, to observe their faith and their joy, which had nothing to do with material goods. They also changed me because of that, because of their trust, their great trust in a loving God, despite the circumstances of their lives. So those were the stories I told.
I hear such a thread of your heart for justice, right?
Yes.
So what you did was not just a feel-good kind of storytelling. It was carrying a banner, right? It was carrying the banner of justice. And I assume that began in the 60s. You were aware and perhaps involved in the civil rights movement. So it seems that what you were doing was such a sacred storytelling and not just PR. I mean, you mentioned PR, but
yes.
really it's a sacred storytelling of the justice of the people, right?
Well, it was, and I have to make a confession here. I have a priest friend in the Diocese of East Carolina who used to say, "You stay out on that limb all the time." But I felt that it was very important to make people aware, to make my readers aware that we can give money and we can be do-gooders, but unless some systemic change happens that deals with justice, nothing is going to change for those people and even for us. And I was very fortunate to be living with a man who took his baptismal vows very, very seriously. And that gave me a lot of encouragement. And I was able to stay out on that limb to create some trouble. But I did not just do it for the diocese. I started writing for the News and Observer in Raleigh, op-ed pieces that hit very hard on issues of injustice. During that time, of course, Nicaragua was very important, and especially South Africa. Mm-hmm. And I wrote a lot about that. And then I had the great fortune, because of my children studying there, to go to Palestine. And I spend a lot of time with Christian Palestinians and with Muslim Palestinians, a lot of time, and with justice-loving Israelis. And I wrote a whole issue of my diocesan paper on that. And that's how the National Church learned about me and my particular passions, and they invited me to go work there.
You know, one of the conversations I remember from the Episcopal communicators, the years that I was in the communicators, one of our ongoing conversations was, of course, this was before the internet. I remember the first time someone said, "Look, you can sit down at your computer and send a note to someone." I was in the diocesan office in Milwaukee. It was like a miracle that I could send a note to you. One of the things that we talked about was whether or not we were doing PR for the church, or whether we were supposed to be gadflies, truth tellers, justice seekers. Do you remember that? That
yes.
Struggle. Did you get pressure when you were on the presiding bishop's staff? Were you supposed to do that, or did you get pushback?
No, I did not at the presiding bishops. I did in the diocese, but not at the office. And every now and then I remember a man calling when the terrible, terrible massacre in Somalia happened in 1994, and started yelling at me, "Why do you care about those people? They're going to kill themselves anyway." That's the only real negative I remember. No, because what I was doing, I was telling the stories of the people. I focused on them, not on my opinion, but on them. They told their stories, the children and the women especially, and some of the men. And by hearing these stories, Episcopalians would contribute to the fund, even though I was not asking for money. I was not the fundraiser. It happened as a result of their hearing those stories. Mm-hmm. Therefore, I was not criticized severely. Of course, the time came when they wanted to change, and they did, and that was fine. But it lasted for 10 years, and it was a very important time in my life, and it's unforgettable, and I'm grateful for it. And it was just lovely to meet all the Anglicans in so many parts of the world.
Which is a great segue to what I would call ecclesia, and you would probably call ecclesia.
Yes.
So you've made the transition from a small church that literally called itself ecclesia, and then you've traveled around the world now as an Anglican and an Anglican storyteller. How I want to end up with what the church is doing and needs to do now, right? The church is becoming something. And so I'm wondering if you can see how your theology of church was formed with all that traveling and storytelling, and kind of point us towards what can we be doing now? Who are we now? Does that make sense?
That's a huge question, and I'm not wise enough to answer it, but I can tell you that what I observed, not just in this community of faith which nurtured me, even though my theology has evolved tremendously since then, but that nurturing in the faith in a God who cares for us has never left me. And so when for instance, a congregation in Haiti, a congregation in Kenya, what I saw was that the church, the community, again, it was an ecclesia, they came together. Even though in Haiti, for instance, they were on the outside, they just had a little thatch roof on the top. And it was the joy they had in being together that was so important. And it was nourishing for them. And it was so vital to them. And then in South Africa, where apartheid was still almost dying, but it was still there and forced. And to see what a difference Archbishop Desmond Tutu made, for instance, when they had this huge gathering of Anglicans. And I thought, this is their lifeline. This is how they exist. And this is what gives them strength. So we cannot do away with church. It's important that we come together because we find strength in one another. And even though we have differences, it doesn't matter. We need this time to sing and pray together. Now, what form this is going to take after the virus, none of us really knows, especially for us Episcopalians, that the Holy Communion, the Eucharist is so important. What form will the Eucharist take for us? But as the voices that talk about an emergent church are saying, a change can come and can be life-giving. It's not going to destroy the church. The church is not going to die. I am convinced of that. So I think it will take maybe a different form. And that will be all right. You know, my own community started as a house church. My grandfather reading the Bible.
Mm-hmm.
And that's really how the ancient church started, reading St. Paul's letters to them. But this is a new thing coming. I wish I could live long enough to see it, but I think it's going to be good. But we cannot not have church. We cannot move away from what gives us life, and then this life goes out into the world because it dies if it doesn't share itself. And I think that's what the Episcopal Church is doing it well.
Do you see that as a function of, this is a trick question, so I'm heads up, this is a trick question. is what you're talking about a function of being involved in issues and justice and living our baptismal covenant in the world, or is it a function of being in community, in comfort, and the Holy Spirit in our small groups?
It's both. It's both. It starts, the word paraclete is the one who begs for us. It's a wonderful Greek word, parakletes. I will send you a paraclete, someone who will ask God for you in your behalf. We have that. But when I used to go speak to various churches in the United States that I knew had money and beautiful buildings, many times I would start my sermon with, I am here to make you uncomfortable. So I don't think the church is there to give us comfort. The church is there to give us nourishment and to give us encouragement. But we fail desperately if we do not proclaim the truth. I think that's what the gospel calls us to do. And more I'm coming to this, and I wish I had enough brain power to write about truth-telling. It is so central to who Jesus was and what Jesus said. And then Paul carries this through. So when we are confronted with lies about the gospel and what justice is, we must respond to that. That's where I am today, very firmly, that we must not remain silent in the face of the distortion of the gospel. We must be as courageous, sometimes as loud and loving as those who tell lies are filled with anger. We must love not just in words and emotions, but also in actions. Like my little church, feeding children who are out of school now because they don't get the school food. This kind of thing is very important. But the other thing, the nourishment in scriptures and in prayer and in song, is equally important.
So if the church that we have known has ended or has been taken away from us, either permanently or just temporarily, does it make it easier to tell the truth, to be a truth-telling body of Christ? And what issues, David Benedict says, what issues would you say the church should be telling the truth about now?
Well, there is terrible inequality in the world. Terrible inequality. We cannot continue existing like this. I think maybe this virus may cause some people to realize this, to be confronted with inequality. It's like living in the Roman Empire, where there were people who had all the money and the rest of them lived in terrible conditions in unsafe buildings that kept burning all the time. We have people today who really do not have any support. And we live in such complex environments that the church cannot do it all, that the state must help the people in order to have decent lives. We cannot turn our faces away, and a lot of us do because we're comfortable. Even in this isolation, we are comfortable, many of us. But there are others who, out of necessity, live in crowded conditions. We need to find some way to change this so that justice means something. We have a God of justice and a God of love, but the primary character of God is justice. Mm-hmm. And we have ignored that for so long. And the established church has done that. All one has to do to be reminded dramatically is to see some of the Victorian shows and how some people of the church treated little children who were in labor markets.
Mm-hmm.
This kind of understanding of the gospel. I think one thing that has changed me drastically from my early faith, and I speak about this in my memoir, that we thought God belonged to us. And I see a lot of this in the conversation about God and Jesus. It's as if it has become a commodity and it's ours. We white Americans have it. We know what it means to be good and to be Christian. No. God is the Father of all. That's a very dramatic realization. Right. It's a stunning realization if we take it seriously. I'm always reminded of Desmond Tutu saying, I genuflect before you, you're a child of God.
Mm-hmm. Annie Dillard says that we wear fancy hats to church when what we should be doing is wearing crash helmets.
I think she's right.
If we really believe it, which makes me think of something that you and I talked about, which is the struggle between good and evil. And this came up in my conversation last week with Greg Garrett, whom you know, and we talked about whether or not the times we're in is a struggle between good and evil. Tell me if you can remember what we talked about. Yesterday, you talked about that struggle and principalities and armor.
Yes.
Talk about that.
I noticed in America that the words sin and evil are avoided, really avoided. And many theologians will not talk about that, about the reality of evil in the world. And I think I must have grown up understanding this or feeling it, and maybe because I grew up in times of war, very much aware of powers and principalities that St. Paul talks about. And there is a kind of a struggle. We were not promised an easy and a happy life. We were promised abundant life. And abundance comes, this kind of spiritual abundance comes out of struggle. And we need to be vigilant about these powers and principalities that have the power to command other people, not for their good, but for their harm. So I'm always aware of it. And I think that we need to acknowledge it in order to be able to resist it.
Mm-hmm. You observed that Europeans have a better understanding of evil.
I think it's because we had war in our soils, and that is very much a part of our upbringing, the stories we heard as infants, being breastfed while the sirens were howling outside and having to go to the shelter. All that gives you the feeling that all is not good for everybody.
And that also, that not being able to escape that reality it doesn't allow you, it means you're not allowed to sanitize religion. No, you can't. Right?
I'm so aware of cheap grace that Bonhoeffer talked about. And that's another thing that I keep constantly in my mind, that we need to be aware of that when it happens and how to avoid it. Can
you define that a little bit for someone who might not know that concept?
Well, just to make it very easy to understand, it's like these phrases that people say. Jesus died for my sins, so everything is all right. I believe in Jesus. But what does that mean? What did it take for us to be able to say words like that? What did it mean for Jesus to be hanging on that cross and crying that cry of dereliction, my God, why have you forsaken me? That is costly grace. And a lot of people are going through that agony in order to arrive to this costly grace.
Right.
There has been a lot of pain in order for us to recognize joy. And I'm not a gloomy person. I'm just a realist that what comes, well, we go back to this, our brokenness. Unless we acknowledge that, we cannot be put back together. And the one thing I constantly remember, even when I get very discouraged, I'm with you always. I'm with you always. And I'm so aware of that. And that wonderful theologian, Werner Désir, that wonderful, wonderful Episcopalian who said, we are not orphans cast out in a meaningless void. I hold on to that, Kathy. I hold on to that. It's an anchor. And Jesus promised that he will not leave us orphans.
So this seems like a good segue to, you said to me yesterday on the phone that let me see, it's not just belief?
It's not belief, it's trust.
Say that again.
It's trust. Yes, the Greek word pistis and pistevome, I put my trust in you. That's what it means. And Jesus asks us to trust him, to trust in God. You know me, you know the Father. That means trust. Not words, not an intellectual repetition of mantras, but the reality of trusting in God even when everything is going to hell around us. And this is a reality for many, many, many people around the world. And I don't care what their faith is called, they trust in their Creator. It's a wonderful thing to see.
So can you just put a kind of a finer point on the difference between belief? Americans talk a lot about believing. I believe. God said it, I believe it, that settles it. Right? That's the bumper sticker. So what's the, just come back to repeat yourself a little bit about the difference between saying I believe and saying I trust.
I believe is an intellectual activity, an intellectual exercise, and many times just putting into words what we think is true. Pistis, trust, is despite everything, knowing that God is. Despite everything, knowing that the character of God is of justice and love. That's a reality of like making that leap, that we jump into that even if we're going to drown, because we trust that we will be held and not allowed to drown. That's pieces, that's trust. Belief is all, most of the time what I hear are words that when you say, now tell me what you mean by that, you're not going to get a good answer because most people don't know. I am appalled, Kathy, having taught for almost 2 decades college students how biblically illiterate the children are. And I mean, these are children who come from Baptist homes, so they go to Sunday school, they hear preachers, they're biblically illiterate. Because in the subject we talk about religion, of various religions, when I talk to them a little bit about how the Bible was written and what it is, the important thing that we hold on to, they are shocked and surprised because nobody has told them this before. So to go back to Ecclesia, on the whole, the Sunday schools in America have not done a good job with the children of this country. Mm-hmm. I think what needs to change in church is the way Sunday school is taught.
I would agree. This conversation was born out of a conviction that that faith formation must continue. We can't say, well, we can't go to church, so I guess we can't do any faith formation. Our faith is being formed all the time. There's something kind of monastic about this time, right? And so it's helpful, very helpful to have input into that deep space so that we can continue to form ourselves at home, right?
Yes.
I'm aware that it's 8 o'clock, a little bit after 8. And I'm wondering if there's anything that you didn't have a chance to say that you, any of your favorite, you're so generous with your time and with your wisdom, and I'd like you to close us with a prayer when the time comes, but I'm wondering if there's anything else that you would like to say to us.
Well, there is an awful lot, but it will take too long a time. But what I would like to say to the people listening, if they have any questions about this, through you, they can ask you. I would be delighted to write them to answer the questions. Absolutely delighted. Mm-hmm. That feeds me also. And now that you're alone and you're reading the Bible, be careful how you read the Bible. Use as much help as you possibly can in order to understand this wonderful, as Verna called it, this wonderful dream of God for us that spans the ages and has not ended. So we are still in that curve, and it's happening in a way that none of us anticipated at Christmas time. We had no idea. And we have to, this is a creative country when it wants to be. And I think this is time for creative thinking.
Will you come and live in Williamsburg and be our Mamika?
Invite me.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. Well, I know that we have a couple of people have asked questions that we didn't get to, and so I want to reiterate your invitation that if there are thoughts that you have that we didn't get to, send me an email, and I'll hook you up with Katerina. I wonder if you would bless us, my friend.
And now, Father of all mercies, we come before you to say thank you. Thank you for the life you have given us, for the life of our Lord Jesus Christ, who taught us how to live and how to die. Thank you for the fellowship we have, even though we cannot touch one another, because we are connected by the great Paraclete that you sent to keep us comforted and not in despair. Thank you for this night and for everybody who is listening to us. Blessings upon all of you in the name of our Lord Jesus Christ. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you, Kathy.
Thank you,
This was
Katerina.
fun.
Yeah, wonderful. So wonderful. Thank you very much. And I know that I speak for everybody when I say what a blessing you are to us. And we'll do it again. Okay?
Fun.
All right, dear.
Like that.
Thank you.
Good night.
Thanks, everyone. And Pan McCaslin says you can't leave Valley Cruises. So,
Great, Ted.
I've been overruled. Righty. Bye-bye. Good night, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Good night, everyone.